A very good afternoon to everybody. On behalf of the Atal Bihari Vajpayee Institute of Policy Research and International Studies, MS University Baroda, it gives me great pleasure to welcome all of you to this book discussion. The book in question is a book which all of you will find very interesting to read. Dr. Shalini Chawla, who is the Center for Air Power Studies, distinguished fellow working on Afghanistan, Pakistan, etc. Therefore, substantial expertise. She'll be commenting on the book. So we're not waiting for the vagaries of the internet. Could I request Sud Sahab to please tell us something about his book, 15-20 minutes, and then Shalini would give her point of view, 15-20 minutes. And the last half an hour or so, we hope to have good. We always get very good question and answers. I really look forward to them actually. Our Q&As are really tough. So Sud Sahab, Shalini, please be prepared for being great. Over to you, Mr. Sud.
Thank you, Sinha, for having me over for this discussion of my book, and I look forward to discussions that follow after I've spoken. And you give me 15 minutes to wax eloquent about my book, which I will do. Somebody has to talk like that. Well, this is my second book actually, and it's a narrative about narratives. You know what I mean? It's about narratives that are hidden at times, obvious at times. I explain that in the book as we go along. It's not a critique. It's not a critique about the way the world works. It's a factual account of how actually things happen, and you might feel that the reader might feel that he's talking too much about the United States. But the thing is, it's the United States all over the globe. The United States is practically everybody's neighbor, and it has the loudest voice. So all narratives that are flowing out into the world are essentially America-based, partly Western-based, but the others don't have that kind of a voice in the system. So what we hear is actually one kind of an account. It's what my book tries to bring out is a factual account about how superpowers or major powers go about the business of building narratives about themselves, their storylines of past grandeur and present nobility, and how good and kind they are to everybody. Actually, it's all about, the whole game is about controlling and dominating. And what the gun or the economic power will do at one level, the narrative will do at another level. And without a narrative, without an adequate narrative, you don't get full mileage out of all that is being tried. So this has become a great, over time, it's not been done yesterday or today. It's not a propaganda like Goebbels would do for the occasion, but this is a consistent, coordinated, sometimes subconsciously coordinated, sometimes with a purpose, with the Iraq War in mind, let's say. So you had a full blast of a narrative being built, and so that's how they create the narratives about their goals. It is not necessarily based on truth. It's based on perceived truth. And the perceived truth is created by them. So it works both ways. So in the long term, the long-term aura that is created is of a virtuous, noble dispensation, which is good for mankind. But essentially it is for profits. Domination is never mentioned. There is a deception, there is ambiguity, and a mixture of fact and fiction. Narratives have normally been written by the rich and powerful countries. As I mentioned earlier, truth is not the only God in this game. And history might have been different. We might have learned history differently if the lion could have written the story and not the hunter. Or if, or what if Hitler had won at Stalingrad? How would history have been written then? So these are what if things. But then I just quote from George Orwell. He says that political language is designed to make lies sound truthful and murder respectable, and to give an appearance of solidity to pure wind. तो मैं हवा में बात करते हुए बड़ा solid लग रही है आपको सब बात क्या क्या कह रहे हैं. So that's how it is. That the power comes from the West. The storylines are from the West, and we have to just accept them. That we have been accepting them so far. And you know, powerful Western democracies like the US are run by the power elites. There is this great drama of democratic elections and so on and so forth. But actually, the top 5% of the population owned 63% of the wealth, or the top 20 own 89%, leaving the rest to be owned by 11%, 89%, sorry. No, I'm getting my figures wrong. Anyway, what I mean is that the majority wealth lies in a small minority. I thought I would quote a bit from my book so that you know how mindsets are created over a period of time. The theme used to be that rule of governance of the world should be entrusted only to satisfied nations and not in the hands of hungry nations. I think Churchill said that, if I'm not mistaken. It was also assumed that cultural superiority, that was the tipping edge by making Western approaches acceptable to the people. So right from Pierce Soap to the classics. So when we listen, in my younger days, we listened to Pat Boone and Elvis Presley. No one at that time listened to Mohammed Rafi and Lata Mangeshkar. At school, we were taught Shakespeare, and I had to go through the wretched Macbeth. But they never taught us Kalidas. So we grew up with a particular mindset. When I was a young kid, there was no history being taught at school. What history would they teach us? That was a big dilemma for the school also. We had not written our history. The history that has been written about us was about the British, which wasn't very flattering. So we had to put up with all that. So my point in the entire thing is that for the last 200 years, this has been controlled by the West, or by the agencies, or the media, or the National Endowment of Democracy, or the Council on Foreign Relations. They are the big bodies who actually help in the creation of a particular mindset. I'm not saying it's wrong. I mean, I think there's something we have to emulate. That you cannot leave it to North Bloc, South Bloc, or their successors, whatever we're going to call them. It has to be done by talented, thinking people. How to portray your own narrative to the world, where unless you get your narrative in first, unless you get your story in first, everything is then seen as a reaction or as a defense. That's not how it should be. It should be first. I say it first. So the narrative building is an activity which is ongoing, which is 24 hours, 24/7. We do it for specific occasions. We make a storyline for invading Iraq. We make a storyline for pulling out of Afghanistan. You know, we make a storyline again if you want to come back into Afghanistan. So all these narratives keep coming and going. And we have to get adjusted to that. We have to do our own stories. So I'll just quote a few lines from my book, and then I'll leave it to Shalini to take me over hot coals. I've said, if a major power with global interests wishes to retain its supremacy or prevent alternate sources of power from emerging, it naturally must be able to tell its story. Tell it first, tell it well, and repeatedly in different ways at different times. All governments lie, bar none, as and when it suits them. The important aspect is to lie first. The principle is be in with your story first, because any other story thereafter is only a reaction. Then I've said that creating narratives and favorable perceptions do not happen by accident. There must be an agenda to do so and must be worked over time. Political dominance is the successful assertion or enhancement of a suitable political narrative, where public opinion in the adversary country turns against its own government. States deploy these tactics to influence both friends and allies. And I also say that the Indian narrative has been run for far too long from elsewhere. It needs to change and cannot be determined in Europe, America, or anywhere else. India and Indians must tell their own story. Western narratives will continue to remain, especially the ones that portray the West's supposed invincibility and superiority. They are often tactical and changeable as well, as I had mentioned earlier. The day we get our act together, they will come to us. So we need to manage our narrative to control our destiny. Thank you very much.
So ultimately, that is the ultimate goal. We need to develop our narrative and not basically rely on
अपनी कहानी खुद बताएं ना.
अपनी kahani. Shakespeare is good, of course, very good, but Shakespeare alone is not enough. We need a Kalidas.
Yes.
So, Dr. Chawla, could I now ask you to critique where you think Mr. Sood is right and where you think that he could have explored this subject more? That is the job of a critic, to be a good, honest, Over to you, Shalini.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. Am I visible, audible?
Yes,
Yep.
you're visible and audible. I'll make myself inaudible for the time.
Okay, sir. Thank you. Good evening, everybody. I would like to thank Atal Bihari Institute for Policy Research and International Studies, and especially Mr. Shakti Sinha for inviting me here. I feel truly honored to be part of this book discussion. And I've always read Sood Saab's writing with great interest. And I still have very fond memory of my first meeting with Mr. Vikram Sood in 2007, when I met him on our way to Trivandrum for a CAPS seminar at the Southern Air Command. And I was truly impressed by his immense knowledge and experience, and I cherished those 3 hours spending with him in the flight, which was my good luck and his bad luck probably. But I truly cherished the time that I spent gaining and learning so much from him. It's a tough task to, do a critique of a book of that stature, where every sentence is worth a quote. Every page that you turn, you are exploring new, and it's just such a fabulous work done. And as a scholar on international security studies for the last 22 years, and as a wife of a corporate, I've lived in the domain of narratives and perceptions during my, So during my journey of a scholar on international relations, I have seen and I'm seeing how critical it has been for nations to build up the perceptions making the world to believe what they actually wanted to communicate. And at the corporate level, I have very closely seen how big powerhouses justified and legitimized their products, even though they could see that there are convincing facts that would not work in their favor in the near future. And then on a lighter note, at a personal level, when you are a mother and you've seen your child growing up, you see how attempts for narrative build up begin at a micro level. The narrative regarding indispensability of using the gadgets, internet, legitimization of how important it is for them, for the millennials to be connected to their peers with social media. So we see these attempts at a very micro level, and then obviously the book discusses it at a very macro level with the big, powerful countries, how they do it. Creations of perceptions, molding the perceptions have been an essential part of every nation's arsenal. And nations have rather successfully managed to cover truth, the main powerful nations, to cover the truth and reality into abstractness. The ultimate goal discusses how the country's ability to construct, sustain, and control narratives at home and at the international level enhances its strength and position. And the intelligence agencies of the countries invariably play a critical role in this regard. A narrative may not be necessarily be based on the fact or truth, as Mr. Sood said, but it is intended to create a desired perception for strategic, economic, and political gains of the country. And during most of the 20th century, intelligence agencies helped shape narrative favorable to their country's agenda through literature, history, music, cinema, etc. A narrative can be offensive or defensive. Defensive mainly when you are trying to build a counter narrative, and that's why the book gives a very strong messages about having the first to, being the first to create that narrative. And most powerful nations have mastered the art of narratives. The book addresses a very critical and an unaddressed area in the domain of international relations and the domestic level. The author takes you in a very fascinating world of narratives. Many untold, unheard stories have been put together to give a deep insight into the world of narratives, which the major powers have used as an indispensable tool of statecraft. The book reveals little known anecdotes of very well-known personalities, incidents, and gives a very fresh perspective on various subjects. For example, America has projected itself as a haven of freedom and speech and liberty, but the book brings out how the freedom was challenged if it went against the American interest. So it talks about it and how the same freedom of speech was used to project misinformation. I've enjoyed reading his previous book, The Unending Game. And obviously, this one is a masterpiece on varied dimensions of narrative and powers of perception building. In my conversation with Mr. Shakti Sinha, he told me that there are going to be large number of students attending the book discussion. I wanted to bring about what the book holds, what it talks about, the main pointers there, and how it is relevant for us in India. The author obviously fills a very critical void in the lack of understanding and importance of indispensability of narrative. The first chapter of the book discusses in great detail what is a narrative and how their aim is strategic and not actually to convey the facts. Yes, nations would use facts for narrative building, but how the narratives are managed to now justify their actions and reactions is something which needs to be studied and analyzed, and which has been done very well in the book. Personally, I've always felt that there is a strong need for India to manage the perceptions and build a narrative which would be to our advantage. And frankly, I have always felt that there has been a big vacuum in the Indian strategy, in India's strategy in that aspect. Now, what is a narrative? I would like to quote a few lines by the author, which actually summarize this commendable work. Just 2 or 3 sentences. One is that facts are not always what they appear to be, but are often what they are perceived to be. Propaganda always wins if you allow it to. Narratives are for self-justification. They are designated by the narrator not only to tell his version his way, but also to tell your version his way. And I think these sentences by the author also talk about when he dwells into the Indian aspect, and he tells that how the Indian narrative has been shaped by the West. And you know, this comes very, very beautiful. The sentence gets elaborated that it's not only his version his way, but also to tell your version his way. The book takes you through a geopolitical journey very, very sharply but smoothly, unveiling very many facts, giving up empirical evidence to support the suspicion which we have carried for very long. For example, we have heard floating stories on arm industries driving the wars, but the book elaborates of giving the facts, and it actually tells you how that happened in the past. So let me talk about some of the critical points which the book offers to its readers and how they are relevant for us in India. The book highlights that over 200 years, most of the narratives have been constructed in the West, as Sood Saab also said, or by agencies and media controlled by the Western interest. And this, what we are seeing today, the Western perception and the fallouts of the strategic orientation of that perception. And if I may elaborate it with the example of Afghanistan, because that's something which we are seeing, all of you are reading it, and the fallouts of that crisis we will face in many, many years to come. We are going to be facing it. If we see the case of Afghanistan today, how the US launched its war on terror and united the Western world under the NATO umbrella to fight a phenomena, terrorism, which had hit the US for the first time in the major way with 9/11. Terrorism has been there, and India has been talking about it loud and clear. But yes, the much needed push in our narrative was definitely lacking. And more importantly, the US strategic interests restricted Pentagon to look at India's position on terrorism, to pay attention to it. So post 9/11, the narrative the US built was that they will fight terrorism, actually building their position that they intend to militarily defeat this ideological, radical war, a war of perception, which the non-state actors, the Al-Qaeda and its allies had launched and expanded against the West. Then in 2003, the US media started to carry sensational stories about the Iraqi nuclear weapon program, and what we saw was the Iraq war and complete destruction of Iraq. The US distraction in Iraq from Afghanistan led to the resurgence of Taliban in Afghanistan with Pakistan's assistance, which they were not fools to not see that, but still the support for Pakistan continued. It was actually made the non-NATO ally of the US because it served the US strategic ambitions, and the narrative was creating around supporting Pakistan. The Iraq war eventually led to the birth of another deadly organization, the Islamic State, and how the American vested interest led to Iraq war, justification of the war has been elaborated in the book. During the 20 years of war in Afghanistan, the perception till 2012, till Osama bin Laden was not killed, was regarding the indispensability of the war. This US surge in Afghanistan took place in 2009, where a very high number of Western forces fighting the war, flow of enormous funds to the Afghan government. The narrative was that the US was determined to bring stability in Afghanistan, have a democratic government in Kabul, and Afghans need to have much awaited freedom and political and civil rights. And certainly the progress happened on these fronts in Afghanistan from a very gloomy and repressive days of the Taliban regime in the late 1990s. What Afghans saw was a fresh breeze of freedom. And the women did come a long way to have access to education and also claim their rights in the social and the political domain. Afghanistan actually managed to have 25% of women representation in the parliament, and this number does represent the journey of Afghan government, Afghan women, which was covered with the US presence and assistance from the international community. And then while the narrative of the long dragged war in Afghanistan was building up at the US domestic front, narrative regarding the need for the US to exit was being built up. What really changed the dynamics was President Trump's restlessness and the pressure he faced within to exit this Afghan war. Biden took a rather hasty decision to exit Kabul with the narrative that the war is unsustainable for the US and he cannot allow the next generation in the US to fight the war and be engaged in the war, which was not theirs. And they had achieved their objective by killing Osama bin Laden, and it was the Afghans who were now responsible for their destiny. We need to remember that the narrative of Afghan-led and Afghan-owned peace process was also highlighted but not actually executed as the US worked with the Taliban to sign the agreement in February 2020. Now, the narrative of US commitment to Afghan democracy and democratic value has suddenly vanished. And what we are seeing is the aggravating crisis in Afghanistan with the Taliban gaining control. The Taliban is playing with the narrative of their victory to hit the morale of the Afghans, especially the Afghan security forces. And I quote the author here: the might of the US lies in the fact that it is the only country in the world today that can make its domestic laws applicable globally, ignore international laws when it suits it, bomb and invade other countries, and walk out when bored. I think this statement actually describes the US strategy in the region. The US decisions have led the region into instability, and now Taliban and ISIS trying to expand their reach and ideology. The US strategy in the region actually changed the face of terrorism in the region that we see. And we will wait and see in the region the spillover of the instability in Afghanistan. In this regard, a point that I feel could have been maybe highlighted and we could have had more thoughts from the author, which would have made the task of policymakers easier in terms of acting on counterterrorism, is that, you know, the US wars in region led to the origin of the most deadly organizations, Al-Qaeda, Taliban, ISIS, and which have now flourished on the narratives they created, the narrative which has been anti-West and anti-America. So I feel if the author had shared some thoughts about the US ability or inability to fight or counter these narratives of the non-state actors, to be able to have the larger objective of containing terrorism through the narratives, because these narratives by the non-state actors were built on the anti-US sentiment. You know, it would have been useful in dealing with the challenge of counter narratives. The chapter on Russia discusses the Russian struggle to counter US narratives, and this started very early in 1950s. The English language worked in the favor of US. US highlighted Putin's dictatorial policies and deceptive acts. And the book talks about the fact that how the narratives resulted in giving Putin a larger than life image, which has been created, which actually helped him in terms of gaining more respect in other countries. The section on China is also very interesting. And the book talks about China's aggressive attempts to formulate a narrative about its rise. China builds the narrative around its ambitions of peaceful rise, proposed its peaceful rise strategy in 2003 as a signal to the world of its peaceful intentions during the rising process. And the strategy is the national policy choice on both domestic and economic needs and international conditions. But the world saw China's aggression and nothing peaceful about the peaceful rise. At the domestic level, China's narrative about now making up for the century of humiliation has been propagated to legitimize what it is doing. And it has been very focused on its rise, and that focus has been at the cost of disregard for the basic values on governance, human rights, democracy, which makes it a very, very attractive investor actually in most of the countries, smaller countries. Beijing also built the narrative about the Belt and Road Initiative, convincing nations that BRI would bring them all the ingredients of prosperity, despite the classic examples of the Chinese death and investment. You see the case of Hambantota port in Sri Lanka, where the Sri Lankans' inability to pay the Chinese loan led to Chinese control over the strategic port. And similarly, stories and facts are emerging out of Pakistan that how CPEC will eventually, lead to the debt burden. But Chinese have managed to have that narrative that it's very good for them. And in fact, they're trying to portray their association and alliance with Pakistan as a model for the other small countries like Afghanistan and Nepal. Chinese narrative is just focusing on the economic benefits. And as I said, it makes it a very attractive investor. The book discusses how China managed to distance itself from the Wuhan virus. It dealt with the virus and handled the criticism and did not fail to make use of the opportunity provided by the pandemic to take forward its plans. We saw what happened in Hong Kong, then in Ladakh. And now coming years will see Chinese efforts to restore its image. In fact, we already see it now when the Chinese Communist Party in the centenary celebrations which were held in Beijing on July 1 and Xi Jinping's speech, it gave us the clues of the path that the Chinese leadership hopes to tread over in the next 100 years. Now coming to India, I can't agree more with the author's assessment that India needs to tell its story, who we are, what we are. It needs to define itself, what is happening right now in some senses. We cannot let the West keep defining us. Also, building India's narrative would be to accept and propagate the notion that country has a civilization and heritage that is much larger and older than the recent history. And yes, it's important to make India's past important, but its future and not get stuck in it. The book says we need to put our house in order. So that is important, but that's like obviously a deep sentence. And what do we need to do about that? The vision of building a new narrative for India, which binds the country in the common thread, will require consistency of a visionary leadership. And I feel what is important here is that we need a consensus on the national objectives. So narrative on national objectives, I think, is very important. And to have a common understanding on what is good for the nation, which I feel is missing in India. Other thing I feel is that India's image need to be strengthened, which author mentioned in the beginning that, there is a dent which India has faced on the, experience on his image at the global level. India with diverse cultures, and the author provides an answer that we need to honor who we are, what we are, and that will bind us together. That diversity will be, we will have bind together diverse people, religion, taking pride in our history. Counter narratives are important, and India needs to formulate the narrative to be, and first to have the narrative. The book talks about the narratives of the big powers, US, Russia, China, and then India. The narratives by the big powers have impacted India directly and indirectly, and Pakistan is a classic example. The US overlooked or even supported to a large extent Pakistan's narrative of victimhood and patronizing terror organizations against India. The narrative of India having hegemonic ambitions have been played for decades by Pakistan, despite the fact that all the empirical evidence, all the wars against India-Pakistan wars were launched, started by Pakistan. In addition to the covert war it conducted for more than 5 decades, India was not successful for a long time to have a counter narrative for Pakistan perception building. Now, after India's rise on the global platform with its economic and technical growth, also when nations develop stakes in India, European nations and US, India is being seen as a valuable partner to counter China. And now India is in a stronger position to convince the world of Pakistan's strategy of using terrorism. Now we have the narrative of Islamophobia coming out from Pakistan, which actually is a call for consensus on Pakistan agenda for Kashmir. So I feel the book is a must read for policymakers, scholars, academicians, strategies. But as all of us want more, I will end with 2 questions for the author, and if I may, sir. Yes, powerful nations create narratives to support their agenda, ambitions, needs, etc. But can an economically weak nation do that? A rare case where I feel a weak nation has done that is Pakistan, but with the support of the West. Do you think economic and military strength is a prerequisite to formulate and sustain an effective narrative? In which case, India's inability to create a narrative for a long time can be understood in this context. Second, yes, you have talked about the importance of India's heritage, our history, culture for identifying who we are. But apart from this, what are India's potential strength that you see which could assist it to build narrative to its advantage, elevate its position? The Indian diaspora is there in every part of the world, which certainly works in India's favor. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Chawla.
Thank
You made my book look much better than it.
So,
Yeah.
she actually raised 2 questions at the end, but India also shared this.
Who?
Please carry on. Please tell us your reaction to Shali's question.
Yeah, yeah, I will be talking about that. I'm just telling Professor Chawla that she's made my book look much better, and I feel delighted to have heard her say that. And who wouldn't like it? But she's made a very generous summary of the book, and I think we're on the same page when we think of making narratives for ourselves. She asked me a question earlier also about the American handling of the Al Qaeda and ISIS and terror, as it were, and where did this strategically go wrong? I should have dwelt more on that. You know, it was a great temptation to go down that road and do a bit of Pakistan bashing and America bashing, but I resisted that. The thing is, when you talk of that, United States made the first mistake. It used the wrong tactics with the wrong ally. So it was doomed from the start. The project, it took 20 years, could have taken 30 years, could have taken 10 years. But this is how it was going to end. If you remember, Obama had made a statement in 2009. I don't remember the exact words, but he said to the effect that by 2011 we'll all be over and we'll have come home. So he was giving a future date. So I had commented in some article also saying that here Obama is admitting defeat in advance. And that's what it has been. From that time on, it was merely a question of time. The Taliban knew they had the time and they had the support of the Pakistanis. The Americans would not do anything. Not even Osama bin Laden being found there did they do anything more than a minor rap on the knuckle. So, you know, these are acts and things that people understand. The other guy understands that this inke bas ka nahi hai. They will not be able to pull it through. So just hang on there. And that's what they've done. And that's how it's going to be. Now you might find another change of narrative. That probably use B-52s have been brought in. There'll be more bombing. There'll be more killing. There'll be more cordite on the streets of Kabul and Kandahar. So it'll go on. But coming to your second question, powerful nations have their narratives, and what should we do? I think if you have economic strength and the way the world is configured today, they will come to you. You know, I saw a minute and 48-second clip yesterday on TV, one of the American TV channels. There was this Nike person saying, "We make so much money in China. Why should you not be friendly with them?" That is the ethos. You read books today, any book on international affairs, there's a lot to be said about China. We don't figure. Barring a little reference here and there, possible rising power, could be a regional power, that kind of thing. We're not in that league yet. So unless you become a $10 trillion economy, unless you make a difference to their way of life, then it'll matter. Then they will listen to you. And you know, I think this is issues like Make in India, Atmanirbhar Bharat. This is good for us, but how it is sold outside is important. It is now taken as an issue that these chaps going to be our competitors. They're not consumers of our goods. They're going to be competitors. They will manufacture goods at a much cheaper rate and undersell us. So they're not going to be happy with that. So we have not, that is the narrative we should have been building Pele. Okay, we are doing this, you will benefit. And how will you benefit? You will get more jobs. Your product we will make and sell from there. We haven't clarified those things. So these are things that you have to do, think it through, and then sell. And the potential of India. You know, I am on the Twitter. I tweeted yesterday that at Tokyo I saw a new India. You know, our strength lies in our youth. It lies in all those people who've been given the Padma Shris yesterday or today, 15 people, unheard of. The common Indian, who's making a difference. So we do our education right, we do our disciplining right, and we've got the youth bulge. If this youth bulge is not developed properly and used properly, it will become a problem for us. So we've got to get this act right. Find them opportunities, find them avenues, find them means to express themselves and attain what they wish to attain. It's not easy. I'm not saying anything of this is easy, but that is what we have to aspire for. We are 1.3 billion people, and you can't just be ignored. So the future is very bright if we get it right, but it's dismal if we don't.
We have lots of questions in the chat box. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
I'm not sure how long my connection is stable, but Sudhir, there are 7 or 8 questions in the chat box from students, some from faculty and others, all very interesting. Shalini, one word only. You remember the old saying from Thucydides, the strong do what they can and the weak suffer as they must. In other words, if the US is imposing its domestic policy, bad luck, you will do the same, you know?
Yeah.
So, Sudhir, our student Pinku has a very interesting question about narratives for the powerful countries creating binaries. How is it possible for non-Western nations to get hold into these discourses, basically, you know? So Pinku Jha, our student, has a question. And then there's 7 or 8 questions. Sanjay Pulipaka, if you can see the questions, it'll save time if you just start responding to them instead of my reading them out, you know? And Shalini, you can add at the end also.
Where can I see these questions?
Chat box पे side में नहीं तो मैं पढ़ देता हूँ.
नहीं,
The
मुझे-
first one, of course,
Okay.
if you go to
Right,
chat,
right. I got this thing.
lots of questions, 7 or 8 questions already. As I told you, our audience is very active. They will not leave you.
I've got 14 of them.
Exactly, sir.
Gosh.
Exactly. तो आप एक मिनट में बताइए. People are keen on knowing your point.
Okay, there's this question from Pinku Jha. Very
Starting
good,
with Jha.
Being a student of Indian political thought and philosophy, I would like to ask a question that how we should see to the narratives which have been propounded by so-called powerful stories that create binary superiority and inferiority. How is it possible for non-Western nations to get hold into this story? Okay, I'll just give you an example how this is done, how this has happened. You know, they ruled over us for 200 years, the British. And somewhere along the line, they decided to adopt Sanskrit as something that they would teach us. Okay. I have seen writings which say that the Indian mind is not good enough to understand Sanskrit. So we should teach them. I've got it in black and white. So this superiority has been built 200 years ago. Now we are not going to be able to get rid of this intent. And there will be the resistance to this. There will be a pushback. So it's not as if we decided to put up a new agency and a new setup and everything is going to be fine after that. No, it's going to take time. It's going to take effort. It's going to take setbacks. So narratives have to be created only by us through our own channels and our means and propagated. How many of your newspapers have correspondents in the foreign countries? So we rely on reports from Reuters, from AFP, from wherever, which is their input coming to us, for which we pay, I imagine. So you're actually paying money to be suborned. This is how it is. So we don't have an agency. We don't post our newspaper people don't post people out on to different places. They have more than 1, 2, 3, 5. How many people do you think BBC has in India? Not the size of an embassy. So that's what we're up against. Not just the mindset, the ability to change it or maintain it. Over more than 7. The next question is from Sanjay. Over more than 7 decades, there have been instances of when India was successful in narrative building. Yes, we were successful in the 1970s, in the events leading to the 1971 war, despite Nixon. Despite Nixon, we had support at that time. And we had support, I think we had support in after 26/11 had. 26/11 happened. But we didn't capitalize on it. That was a wasted opportunity. What kind of institutional framework space is required for narrative building? Are we building? I don't know whether we are building or not, so I cannot comment on that.
So can I just add to this question?
Please.
Vikram sir, can I do that?
Yeah, please.
So, sir quoted 2 very significant examples of how India was successful during 1971 war and the support that we had post 26/11. But if you see the last 5-6 years, I think we have strengthened the narrative building with respect to certainly Pakistan. We managed to build that narrative, which is on facts. It's not something we kind of build around a fictitious story, but highlighting and getting the world to believe in Pakistan is being using this terrorism as a strategy of foreign policy tool against India. So what we saw in, that because of our narrative build-up, because of our efforts, Pakistan was put in the FATF grey list, it's been struggling to get out of it for the last 3 years. It went into the grey list in 2018 June. Then also our reaction to Pulwama, Balakot did not have any adverse international reaction. So I think I see it as a success of India's narrative building. Also our position on 370, revocation of 370, we did not see the international community reacting to that decision despite, Pakistan jumping up and down, China talking about it. So there has been a narrative build-up, a successful narrative build-up which is happening, but the momentum obviously needs to continue and a lot of more work needs to be done in that direction. But to your question that do we have instances? Yes, we do have instances. Thank you.
Thank you for adding these on. My only thing is these are probably temporary. So we'll have to wait and see how it goes. Mm-hmm. But yeah, you're right. There has been a difference. And people look at us with a different perspective now. But they haven't given up on CAA yet. Anyhow, back to the questions. Thanks. Where is it? Okay.
Sir, I'll
chat.
narratives in international arena, or they're just norms applied to third world countries? In other words, do the rules apply to the big, or only we have to follow the rules?
No, where is it? Which question are we? Ashish
It's
Kota.
Ayush Rai, just after Sanjay Pulipaka. Just after Sanjay Pulipaka. Up
Okay,
नीचे
so
पहुंच गए. Ashish is right at the bottom.
Oh,
I
Sanjay.
know.
And then
That's why I
Ayush.
said. I told you, you have many questions.
Ayush.
Ayush Rai.
Ayush Rai.
Ha. Ha.
No, there is no rule-based order in setting narratives in international arena. They will not ever let you have that. These are all that we draw up ourselves and make ourselves. We run our story as we go along. It's like a Bollywood movie. Chalo ye scene bhi add kar do. You know, it's sort of building like that. I'm not literally like that, but they won't let you do it. You'll have to do it yourself. And there will be no international arena, all national. Using international means, using international forums. Then the next question is from Neeraj. How can India build a strong narrative against China? What strategies does India need to develop to counter it for the long run? Your narrative against China depends on your relationship with China. Your relationship is adversarial. So you have to bring out a narrative which displays your strength and determination. And I think we've exhibited that pretty well in Doklam and in Galwan. So the point that is, if somebody is going to come at you as a bully, you've got to go back to him as a bully. Stand up and be counted, as they say. That's what we've been doing. So China is a harsh country. It treats its own people despicably. So how do you expect it to treat us any better? Numbers don't matter to them. It didn't matter to Mao. He killed millions. It didn't make a difference to him. They can do what they like, the genocide with the Uyghurs. It doesn't matter. Or they can do what they like, the Tibetans. We're a democracy. So we have to keep that in mind also. But you stand up to China, I can tell you, every Indian will support you. Every Indian. So these are about China. I'm not so worried in the sense that they will score over us on narratives. But it is a harsh country, and we have to be careful how we handle it. And they're not a forgiving country. They're not like us. Magnanimity doesn't come to them. So, do you think that rhetoric is an essential component of narrative? Oh, absolutely. Rhetoric is an art form as far as narratives are concerned. So you have to be rhetorical about the whole story and play it up. Look at the way the Americans play up their story. God bless America if nobody else matters, and everything is good about America and everything is rotten about everybody else. So that's a bit extreme, but we should have our own rhetoric, and we shouldn't be ashamed about it. India's narrative since independence is from Colonel Dilip Sopore, or lack of it till date, just for a historical perspective. Oh, we didn't have much of a narrative in the beginning. We wanted to be socialist, kind and gentle everywhere, peace loving, surrounded by two enemies, but didn't really understand that. I think we thought goodwill and peace talk will get us. We didn't. And this is a harsh world. So we moved along. I think we seemed to go along for the first 60 years piecemeal, bit by bit, jugaad. But I think there is a definite change now. And there is a definite change in economic activity, in politics, and as Shalini mentioned, those two very important issues that we've taken up. These are things that change your narrative. They change when you start looking at yourself differently. You will look at the world differently also. And when you have the confidence in yourself, then you will not be easy to be suborned by them. So we have nobody will make us great. Nobody will help us become great. We'll have to do it on our own. It has to be. You can't be a superpower or a major power with borrowed weapons. It's simple. So you have to develop all these things yourselves. This aircraft carrier has taken off. That's a delightful thing to know. That's a change. Of course, it wasn't done overnight. It's taken years to do it, but it's happening. Economic change, military change, the way we deal with our foreign relations. And I think, I feel, I may be wrong, I get the impression we've still not been able to tackle our neighbors best as we should. A country's strength also depends on how it treats or deals or interacts with its immediate neighbors. You can forget Pakistan, it's going to be like this. So we're treating them right now. The way we're treating them is fine. But the other smaller countries, we have to give them more importance. How many of us actually think of Myanmar as a neighbor? Honestly. We don't, because it doesn't give you any trouble. Poor fellow just minds his own business, and you think Myanmar is somebody has asked me once. I said, so-and-so is in Rangoon, he's gone abroad. I said, but isn't that part of India? He's saying this 50 years after independence. Indian. I thought only Americans could do these kinds of things. Me either. So we haven't treated our neighbors like we should treat them. Not coddle them, mollycoddle them all the time, but pay more attention. I mean, that's the more important thing. Pay more attention to your lesser, smaller neighbors. You'll get a long way through. What is the role of third world countries in narrative building? I don't think we third world countries have much of a role. We are at the receiving end of narrative at the moment. It has to be all imported narratives. What are the means of communication, of spreading your narrative? We have nothing. Even India doesn't have anything. How many of our TV channels have stations abroad? They sell, I think Vion has something and ANI has something. That's it. Nobody else. We all sit in our desks in Delhi and wax eloquent and tear down the government, and we've achieved a lot of intellectual satisfaction in that. So, narratives, हमें को बनाना है, time लगेगा. This is a nice one. Can a state spread a narrative only through historical and cultural connections, or does it always require a villain like what the West and US often do? Well, it works in the movies, but at home and on these things, look, there is no point in being goody-goody all the time. You have to be practical and real in this very real world. So, if you have to twist a story, be a little, what is the word? generous with the definition of truth, you can get a lot of things done. So what you need is a credible source who or a person or an institution which will spread that word. That institution building takes time. And that cannot be seen to be pro-government. Then it doesn't work. It has to be independent and seen to be independent, but Indian. So it's not easy. It's not easy. We get caught up with our egos and everything else. And the thing falls flat after some time. We haven't evolved as a nation which has major global ambitions. I mean, we keep saying we are a country, we never conquered anyone. Why do you want to say it? There's no use. They'll get no brownie point for saying it. How does our domestic narrative compare with our international narrative? Well, the international narrative gets affected by your domestic narrative. That is true. You can't totally separate them. And if you're tough at home and weak abroad, if you're tough at home, actually it's easier to be tough abroad also. But if you're appeasing at home, you'll be appeasing outside. So you get no brownie points for being gentle and kind. You get what you want to. If you want to score a goal, you don't say "Pehle aap." You go and do it yourself.
Absolutely.
So, practical statecraft is an extension of your normal individual behavior multiplied by X items of ruthlessness. Okay, you're quoting me. Real power comes not from the barrel of a gun, but from those who control the narrative. So it is what kind of narrative that has been built by the global superpower and compel US to pull out from Afghanistan without completing. The reason for US failure in Afghanistan is a little different from the failure of Russia, Soviet Union in Afghanistan. The US failed because it had the wrong ally. And it was fighting a near conventional battle against insurgent forces, which is not going to work. You cannot fight insurgents from the air. You have to have boots on the ground. This is how we tackled our insurgency taught us. Not once did we put in the Air Force. Not once. The first thing you do is to use drones, and you use B-52s, and you think you smashed the fellows. No, you probably killed 100 innocents too. So that becomes a losing battle. Okay, that's it. Thank you.
Wonderful. I must say, Sood Saab, it was so delight that you patiently went through every one of those questions very, very patiently. And before we conclude, just to wrap up, I think, yesterday somebody was very excited that America is using B-52 in Afghanistan. I said, yes, you will kill some Taliban foot soldiers. You will kill lots of innocent people.
Yeah.
But the guys actually planning the war and organizing the war are across the Durand line, and they're safe. You had to lose in Afghanistan because the people you thought were your friends were your enemies. And as Karzai said in 2006, you're fighting on the wrong side of the border. The war has been fought on the other side of the border,
Yeah.
not on this side, So narrative is important, and I'm glad that we got so many questions out of it. Suddenly, what seemed like a romantic or esoteric topic like a narrative for political scientists imagined communities of Anderson. I think you brought it out to life, both you and Shalini, Dr. Chawla. Both of you, I think, really have brought a lot of light on this subject, And as I'd warned both of you, our audience asks questions. They love to
Yeah,
tease
that's
things
it.
out from our speakers,
If your audience asks questions, that means they've been listening to you.
Exactly. And they want
If
to
they
know.
don't ask
They're
questions, that
genuinely
means either
curious.
you are damn boring, or they just switch it off and said,
Or they
bye
lose
bye.
it. Exactly. Exactly.
So
So
even if I
let
can't
me
answer the
thank
question, at
both.
least the question has been asked. That's okay.
So thank you very, very much, Tutsab. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dr. Shalini Chawla. Thank you to our audience. Though for some reason today our internet has been very bad. Number of people have joined and dropped out, joined and dropped off. Obviously, the clouds are playing havoc. The clouds are playing havoc.
Yeah.
Despite that, I think we've had a very good session. We had a very energetic, a very enlightening, and
I enjoyed it.
both sides conversation. So thank you
Yeah.
very, very much for it.
I enjoyed myself. Thank you.
Thank you.
Really,
Thank you.
really.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you, Shalini. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.